Okay, let's go ahead and get started again. So here's another question that we keep struggling with and coming back to in Catechesis, and we'll talk some more about this after lunch too. But how do we help teens choose the right path and avoid risky ones? Here are some things I think we can do from the research. One is to pay attention to the family meal. Columbia University, every few years, through their Center for Addiction and Substance Abuse, does studies comparing kids that eat regular meals together with their families and kids that don't, and some of the outcomes and the variables that are correlated with that. So the way that they define this is kids that eat at least 5 to 7 meals per week with their family versus kids that eat 2 or fewer meals together with their family. So kids that eat 5 to 7 meals per week with their families, they have lower levels of tension and stress at home. They're happier, they have better peer relationships, they get better grades in school. They're more likely to confide in their parents. They have healthier eating habits, a lower risk of suicide, and a much lower risk of substance abuse. And the list goes on and on. What's interesting about this is, sociologists and others have sounded the alarm about our culture getting away from family meals because this is the first time in history, in any culture, that people don't come together as family and have meals together. This is an experiment. Nobody's ever tried this before, not having family meals. Throughout history, every culture, and even today around the world, most cultures, they still gather for family meals on a regular basis. Except we're getting away from that in the United States. And when we look at some of the outcomes that are correlated with having regular meals together versus those kids that aren't, and it's not just a correlation that that there's no causation in, because there's a new study that just came out this year that talked about how people are more likely to find points of agreement when they're gathered around the table eating the same food. They did this study where they would have people negotiating positions on things, and they would either be gathered around a conference table with no food, or they'd be gathered around but they would be eating different things, or they would be gathered around the table and they would all be eating the same thing. Guess what they found? In the case where they were gathered around but they were eating different things, they still had to go through several rounds of negotiations, not as much as when they weren't eating. But when they were gathered around, they were all eating the same thing. The negotiations, the rounds of negotiations they had to go through to agree were just a small fraction of the number that they needed when they weren't eating the same thing. Isn't that interesting? It also says something about how the Eucharist brings us together in our family meal as a church, doesn't it? Because we call it communion for a reason. I mean, it's communion certainly with Jesus Christ, but it's also communion with one another. And we're all eating the same food, right? But when families gather together around a table and they're eating the same food together, they're more likely to begin to understand one another better and to communicate better and to see eye to eye more. And science really backs this up. And so catechists and leaders can serve an important role by helping families appreciate the value of the family meal, its connection to our faith, and the ways in which it can draw us together. Let's talk a little bit about risky behaviors. One of the big questions out there has been, how do we keep kids from getting into really risky behaviors, like becoming sexually active when they're very young, and exposing themselves to all the dangers, physical and spiritual and psychological, that go along with that, getting into drugs or alcohol or things like that? How do we help them stay on the right path and avoid those kinds of dangerous behaviors? There was a team of researchers from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Waterloo in Ontario that looked at risky behavior in terms of, well, they were looking at early sexual behavior and how to steer kids away from that. And they were working with junior high age kids. And so, out there in the secular world, kind of the folk wisdom is abstinence education programs don't work. You can have abstinence education, but they don't work, and they don't protect kids, and they don't make them less likely to engage in dangerous behavior. And so the only alternative to that many people see is comprehensive sexuality education. Teach them everything they need to know about sexually transmitted infections and condoms and, pregnancy prevention and all of these things, which is, as a psychologist, for me as a psychologist, one of the things that I'm very conscious of is psychological dangers of early sexual behavior. I mean, let's the spiritual dangers is something else. And of course, as Catholics, we recognize and understand that. But the psychological dangers of getting involved in that behavior so young, all of these kinds of things do nothing to, whether or not they use condoms, whether or not, they're aware of sexually transmitted infections or don't get pregnant. That does very little to minimize the psychological damage that can be done from that kind of behavior. So for me, it's kind of like saying, well, if you're going to drive drunk anyway, be sure and wear a seatbelt, right? Well, that's not a message that we would get. You've never seen that on a billboard, have you? If you're going to drive drunk, be sure and wear a seatbelt. No, because our message is don't drive drunk, right? And there are important reasons for not doing that. So how can we be more effective in steering kids away from dangerous behaviors? Because the abstinence education programs, for the most part, that are out there don't have the best results in terms of the data when we look at the data. And here's why. Because most of those programs focus on risks, on the risks of engaging in this behavior. So, don't have sex because you could get pregnant, you could get a disease, this or that. Here's the thing. Teenagers feel invincible. You know that, right? They are the biggest that they've ever been. They're, for the most part, usually pretty healthy. They've got lots of stamina. They feel invincible. And if you tell a teenager 99 people out of 100 will die from doing this, you know what they think? I'll be the one. I'll be the one, right? And so risk-based prevention of this kind of stuff really doesn't work. But here's what does work. In this study, Jemmett and Fong from the University of Pennsylvania and University of Waterloo in Ontario, they had two different groups. In one group, they used, and these are government universities, and they have no investment in the kind of morality that we would espouse. So their control group was they had one group where they just used comprehensive sexuality education with these junior high students, like they would get in many different schools from people like Planned Parenthood and other things. So with one group they did that. With another group they did something new. What they did was they gathered the kids together in small groups with adult facilitators, and they asked a very important question. Where do you see yourself 10 years from now? What would you like your life to be like? And they encouraged those kids to dream about their future and to set goals for themselves. And then they started having a conversation with peers and with the adult facilitator about what would be the things that would help get you there where you want to be. What are some of the things that could keep you from getting there? Let's talk about it. When they did this kind of risky behavior prevention, they found those kids were much less likely to engage in risky behaviors. Much less likely than kids who had been in abstinence-only programs, the standard kind. This was also an abstinence-only program in the sense that it wasn't a comprehensive sexuality education program. But the typical kind of, they did much better than those kids. They also did much better than those kids that had been through comprehensive sexuality education. So what did we learn from that? Programs for prevention of risky behaviors shouldn't be fear-based primarily, but they're more effective when they're goal-focused, when they encourage critical thinking, when they allow group discussion of the issues involved. Because when you have an adult facilitator and a small group of peers, usually the teens that are there kind of know what the right answers are, and they know how the discussion ought to go. And and you're the adult facilitator, and they're going to probably want to say the right things for you. But they hear one another too. And so those peers at that age are very important. And so if the peers are kind of pointing out and talking about, hey, I know what would help you with that goal, these things, but this is something that could get in your way, they're going to listen to those peers about those things. And so it's a great way to kind of guide that discussion. Jemmett, and Fong is the citation for that if you'd like to look it up. Number 5, let's look at social science research on kids' choice of role models. How do we get kids to pick better heroes and role models, right? That's a big question, right? Well, have you ever noticed that when you see a commercial for a toy on television, the kids playing with the toy, I mean, if you step back and think about it, maybe you've noticed this before. Usually they seem like they're too old to be playing with that toy. I mean, like the 10 and 11-year-olds playing with the Barbie dream house. I mean, have you ever looked at that and gone, my child that age wouldn't want to play with that, right? The advertisers know that. They're not stupid. You know who they're marketing to when they have 10 and 11-year-old girls playing with a toy? They're marketing to the 5 to 8-year-old girls, right? Because kids that are a little older are the ultimate in cool. Right? And so if kids look at something, they see kids that are a little older, they're automatically attracted to that. And they want to be like those kids. We used this principle when we developed Alive in Christ. One of the first things that I did as a child psychologist was I went through all of the imagery that we were choosing, and I let them know which ones the kids looked too young. We tried to make the kids look just a little older than the grade level that we were targeting it for, because those kids would look really cool. If we have images of kids praying or, celebrating sacraments or stuff, and the kids look young to those kids, is that going to look cool? Not usually, right? So we can use this by also choosing some young saints to hold up as examples. So, for example, saints like St. Dominic Savio, St. Clare of Assisi, who started her work when she was probably a teenager or at least a young adult. St. Francis of Assisi as well was young when he started his ministry. Blessed Jose Sanchez del Rio, who was martyred at a very young age, I think 13 maybe. Do you know about Blessed Jose Sanchez del Rio? If you've not heard his story before, it's quite a story. There's a movie that he's one of the key characters in that came out a couple of years ago called For Greater Glory. It's about the Cristero movement in Mexico. So Jose Sanchez del Rio was a little boy who watched when Mexico was overtaken by socialists who tried to squash Christianity in the country and made it against the law to say Mass and to gather in churches. Did you know that? Did you know that happened in the beginning of the 20th century? Yeah. I think it was 1920s maybe, right? And they were making it again. They were going in and shooting up churches. They were executing priests who would dare still be priests. And people were afraid. And Jose Sanchez del Rio watched his priest be executed. He watched his godfather publicly deny his faith so that he could save himself. Can you imagine a little boy watching their godfather, who's supposed to be their example, publicly denounce their faith so that he could save himself because he was afraid? And you know what Jose Sanchez del Rio said? I won't deny my Jesus. I'm not going to deny my church. And so he went to find the people that were rebelling against this, the Cristeros. And he said, I want to fight with you. And they looked at this little boy and said, you're not going to fight with us. You're a little boy. But he wouldn't leave. And so they said, okay, if you're going to hang around here, you can carry the flag. You can be the flag bearer. So he was the flag bearer for the Cristeros. Well, eventually, Jose Sanchez del Rio was arrested. And, usually they would kind of arrest these people, and then they would give them a choice that they could either publicly renounce their faith or they could be executed. And they got to him and they said, we don't want to kill a little kid. So, just say the words. Just say the words that you renounce your faith, and we'll just let you go. You know what he said? Viva Cristo Rey! Long live Christ the King. And they killed him. But he knew that there was something more important than life. And that's eternal life. Right? Amen?
Amen.
What a great example for kids today, that even when everybody around you, even when the adults that are supposed to be your examples are doing the wrong thing, you can choose to do the right thing. You can say some things are more important than fitting in. Some things are more important even than my very life. Right? Jose Sanchez del Rio, Saint Therese of Lisieux, who is forever going to be cool because she died at 24, right? So she's always a young adult, and she's a great one. Saints Francisco and Jacinta Marto. We've got this blessing of all these newly beatified and canonized young saints now that we can draw from. In a similar way, these are two of the visionaries of Fatima, right? When they had the vision of Mary at Fatima and they told people about it, they were arrested by local authorities and threatened with torture. They were told they'd be boiled in oil and separated, and they were told the other one's being boiled right now. And even then they wouldn't deny what they saw. They said, we saw this lady, and this is what she said, and this is an important message, right?
I'd just like to add to that for younger kids, like Francisco. The Blessed Mother told him he did not see the Blessed Mother, and she told him, "You pray the Rosary more," and then he did. He prayed much more, and then he saw her. So instead of using the murder, because the kids get real freaked out.
I wouldn't say with little kids to use the boiling in oil part. No, I would.
But I've used it on the good
Right.
side.
Yeah, don't misunderstand. I'm a child psychologist, so I'm not recommending that you tell the scariest stories to little kids. When you're working with teenagers or middle school age kids, I think Blessed Jose Sanchez del Rio is a great story for those middle school age kids, because he's on the older end of the middle school age, right? So I think that's a great one. When you're talking about those saints of Fatima, I wouldn't get into some of those details, especially with younger kids, but talk about how they were brave, that some people didn't believe them or made fun of them, and they said, no, this is what Our Lady said, and how they were brave anyway. Even though some people didn't want to hear it. Let's just have a couple of questions for reflection here that I'd like you to take some time to discuss at your tables. How can what we know about human development, behavior, and family functioning help us be more effective in ministry? And then number 2, what unanswered questions remain that might be answered at least in part through the integration of psychology and catechesis? So let's take a couple of minutes to discuss those at your tables, and then we're going to have some other stuff before we have lunch together. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I should mention, I'm going to post the notes from today. In fact, I already posted them. Sneaky as I can be. Already posted them online at sharingcatholicfaith.com. And if you go to my recent and upcoming talks calendar, scroll underneath that, and down at the bottom you'll see several presentations linked there. And this one is called 5 Ways Psychology Can Inform Catechesis. Yesterday's is also there, and I also post direct links to those talks on Twitter and Facebook, and you'll see the links for those on the website as well. sharingcatholicfaith.com.